Nous formons la prochaine génération pour relever les défis stratégiques de demain. Nous sommes dédiés à comprendre pour mieux agir.
Martin, who's a co-director of the network. Yesterday, we had two panels and one keynote speaker. We started speaking about the concrete manifestations of a fractured international order by analyzing the role of China, the United Nations, and the tensions in the Middle East. What was clearly expressed that on all levels, Canada is facing some major constraints and has very little control on the security environment in certain areas. In Iran, for instance, Canada is on the margins when it comes to either the increase or decrease of sanctions, but our military presence in Iraq and the Persian Gulf is being impacted by this very fluid and unpredictable context. Yesterday, we also spoke about the increased capacity building role of Canada in conflict management. Can we expect more predictability once Joe Biden enters the White House? Will there be a turnaround in the U.S. foreign policy? Some analysis have been published in the months prior and post this election often contradict each other on this region and on the topic that is the subject of this analysis. Against this backdrop, will an increased focus on multilateralism continue to be viable? That's something we'll look at this morning, which will be followed by our keynote speaker from Miss Marina Henkel from the Hertie School. And I'll turn it over to my co-chair. Thank you, Stephanie. This morning's panel will be addressing multilateralism in free fall. That's a very tough statement, but it is also being expressed. The Secretary General of the United Nations and the European Union and foreign representatives, multilateralism is attacked from everywhere, whether it be in the United States by the rise of populism, whether you see the break in the major powers, as well as the changing influence of the major powers and the differences between Western allies. So to think about this free fall of the multilateralism, I'd like to turn over to Sarah-Myriam Martin-Brûlé, who will be moderating this panel. She is an associate professor at Bishops University, and she handles the second axis of the Strategic Analysis Network. You have the floor. Sarah-Myriam, thank you very much. I'm extremely pleased to be moderating this panel on multilateralism this morning. Multilateralism can either be a concerted approach. It's often being discussed by many actors. It is, however, a common point, and it's something that we use to describe cooperation at more than three levels. The pandemic has once again put this first and foremost on the agenda. It was a theme that Stephanie mentioned that we also used to underscore the contrast between the new Biden administration and the U.S. Multilateralism is back, diplomacy is back, said the future American ambassador to the UN, Farmers Greenfield, and Macron has insisted that we can't be satisfied with what he called multilateralism of words. Action must be collective. And in fact, multilateralism, as some will say, will take on its meaning in collective action beyond the institutions such as the UN, the ASEAN, the European Union, where we have a great deal of rhetoric. It is the implementation of common policies that will build the strength of multilateralism. Without these institutions and beyond, the number of states that are member states will only become forums for competition or further instruments used by the member states either to challenge the world hegemony or to reinforce the existing world order. So what about the United Nations, ASEAN, and the EU? So to discuss the issue, whether or not multilateralism is in free fall or not, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Professor Marie-Joëlle Zahar, as well as Stéphanie, Martel, and Costanza Musu. I invite you to read their detailed bio in the agenda. Just a few words will, however, be said to introduce each of them. Marie-Joëlle Zahar is a full professor of political science. She was senior expert in UN Department of Political Affairs, research director of the Réseau de Recherche sur les Opérations de Paix, Université de Montréal. From 2009 to 2005, she was invited scholar at the Center for International Security Cooperation of Stanford University, as she also worked at the United Nations. The title of her presentation is Back to the Future, the United Nations in Turmoil. Stéphanie Martel is assistant professor of political studies, specialized in international relations at Queen's, where she's also a fellow at the Center for International and Defense Policy. Before joining Queen's, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Asian Research, UBC, and at McGill. She's an executive member of the Canadian Council for Southeast Asian Studies and active member of Women in International Security. Her presentation's title is Contributions to Multilateralism and Regional Order in Asia Pacific. And Costanza Musu is an associate professor of public and international affairs at the University of Ottawa. She was an assistant professor of international relations at Richmond University, UK. She has been a counselor for the Military Center for Strategic Studies, Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Her presentation is The European Union and Multilateralism. So I will turn it over to you. We'll first hear from Marie-Joëlle Zahar, 12 minutes, and then we'll come to a Q&A. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you, and thank you to the organizers for having invited me. Today, I would like to speak about the United Nations in torment. Because in turmoil, because it is at the UN and at the Security Council that we're seeing so much turmoil, such as the international order that is fractured. We can even explain the time when this occurred. In October 2011, NATO, mandated by 1973 of the Security Council of the UN, launched the operation in Libya. Never mind what actually happened. Russia and China saw this operation as being a Trojan horse, which would aim for a change in regime and the overthrow of Gaddafi. The consequences quickly appeared. There was a standoff at the Security Council, the constant use of the right of veto by one or other of the permanent members, the Ukraine crisis. We also had Russia in Crimea, and Trump came to power. And again, the end of multilateralism, the Venezuelan crisis, the situation of the Uyghur in China. Again, we saw the reconfirmation of a strict interpretation of national sovereignty by the powers who act as leaders of protest in the international order. Nothing better shows this tension than the inability of the Security Council at the UN to take charge of the COVID pandemic, as it had done previously with Ebola, to push concerted international action to face the common danger. But in 2020, they were absent. The Security Council waited almost 7 months to finally pass 2952 to call for a ceasefire by Antonio Guterres. And in March of the same year, this was issued. He asked for a global ceasefire of global hostilities to focus international efforts on the pandemic. What I'd like to try to give some thought to is the impact of all this on the UN's ability to fulfill its mandate of peacekeeping and international stability. I will concentrate on one specific instrument, that is peacekeeping operations. In a fractured international order, what are the challenges that peacekeeping operations face? Will they disappear? Will they survive as such, or will they change? The United Nations has the right instruments to face these challenges. And I would suggest on a semi-optimistic note that the current context could in fact give rise not to only threats, but also to opportunities for peacekeeping missions. We could spend infinite time on the topic. Given that we have little time, I will focus on 4 challenges and then propose a few possibilities for thought and something that the UN should answer. First of all, the nature of the conflicts. The second, sovereignty. Thirdly, the sustainability of peacekeeping operations results. And fourthly, the Security Council. So let's begin with the nature of the conflicts. The international fractured order is tied to a rise of conflicts. According to the Conflict of State program, we're seeing an increase of interstate conflicts as well among states. That began in 2011. Not only are there more conflicts as well, they are more complicated and they have many impacts. There is the terrorist and extremist threat, and these are not negotiable. the application of regional international powers. In some cases, they're seeing the return of a war by proxy, non-respect of international humanitarian right, as well as the impact of factors such as climate change on the intensity of conflicts, as well armed conflict with the international criminal organizations, and a rise in so-called gray zone conflicts, as well as the increasing use of high-tech technology by those responsible for conflicts. Wars last longer. They are no longer limited to the specific national territories. There are more civilian victims, and more specifically, these resist any mediation efforts. We should also indicate that interstate wars, of which we said that they were relics of the past as well, seem to be present again internationally. Given this backdrop, UN badly financed and insufficiently equipped and staffed operations of peace of the United Nations are having difficulty fulfilling their extreme mandate, specifically their role to protect civilian populations. We have to recognize that all researchers agree to say that peacekeeping operations are able to reduce the number of victims, both civil and military, that they prevent conflict from extending, and they prevent them from reoccurring. Second challenge, sovereignty. The resurgence of a limited interpretation of sovereignty is seen on several levels tied to peacekeeping operations. The states where we have deployment of these missions, even under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, are fighting against those who feel that this is an interference in their internal affairs. I could cite these examples during our Q&A, but Mali and Central Africa come to mind. As we already underscored at the beginning of the presentation, we're seeing a return of sovereignty, and this is contributing to blocking the Security Council. But these are also translated by a reassertion of regional powers who often ignore the UN, international law, and the authority of Security Council in pursuing their own agendas. The best example would be the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has had an impact on the war in Syria. And this return to sovereignty reduces the leeway of these and the ability to act of these missions. Both military and civilian actors do not want to act. They often don't want to get involved. They want to be designated as unwanted persons on an operational level. This also reduces the political space where these missions can take place, their ability to speak to all of the actors, their ability to pursue objectives which are now stand in a tension with their mandate. That is, they want to support the state authority in a specific region, on the other hand, to contribute to efforts of dialogue to find a peaceful resolution to conflicts involving all of the concerned actors. Increasing sovereignty, therefore, has a further repercussions for missions. In fact, there's the matter of impartiality, specifically when the host country demands that the UN provides them with military support and, for example, also to help them in fighting terrorism, all the while preventing them from acting politically. Third challenge, the sustainability of the missions. The multidimensional peace operations are huge social, political, and engineering projects. Progress cannot be counted in years and even less in months. But in countries where peacekeeping operations are funded, as well as those who contribute troops, and the host countries have difficulty accepting this reality. For host countries, mainly, it is about denying their sovereignty, and it is a kind of international trusteeship that these peacekeeping operations seem to represent. Often missions are prematurely ended. This is followed by development, which further underscores the fragility of the actors, as we saw in Burundi, as well as in Cote d'Ivoire recently, as well as for countries contributing troops. The troops find themselves in unstable situations. And again, this raises the issue of how much decision-making leeway they have. Again, they are facing a situation where rich countries are seen as taking the decisions, and the lesser rich countries have to take on all of the risks. And finally, regarding New York, there's the issue of sustainability. There are two issues that come to mind. First of all, assessing the results and financing that I will revisit later when I'll address the fourth challenge, that is the Security Council. So the struggles within the Security Council, as we previously underlined, limit the ability of the Security Council to act. And not only has it been paralyzed in a number of issues, but this paralysis also sends a signal to the regional powers who come in to fill the vacuum. As a result, for peace operations, this means that they have to share the operational theater with the troops on the ground under other standards, as per other mandates, often in direct contradiction with the objectives pursued by peacekeeping operations. But this conflict at the Security Council also has other repercussions, which I think need to be touched on. There is profound disagreement as to finality of peace operations. Are they there to work on the underlying causes of conflicts, to ensure the rule of law, or to permit dissent? What is a stable country? This will have an impact on the mandates and the priorities of peace operations. In some countries, such as China and Russia, there is increased opposition to the inclusion of certain themes in the mandates, that is human rights, or again, gender equality. This disagreement at the Security Council also gives rise to the ability about the issue, that is, does the Secretariat have the means to put into action the mandates? If that were the case, the United Nations would lose relevance in the eyes of many member states. And disagreement within the Security Council also has repercussions on how the Security Council assesses efficiency of operations. Today, let us focus on performance indicators and let's have a technical framework for assessment rather than evaluating the outcome of these missions based on a political solution. This was always the end point of these missions. And I think there's one point we need to raise, that is financing. The approved budgets for peacekeeping operations for 2019-2020 is probably $6.5 billion. This is less than 1% of the total military expenditures worldwide. And yet, this is also an almost 2% drop compared to 2018-2019. More specifically, this is necessary due to the U.S.'s decision, which is the largest contributor to peacekeeping operations budget, to cut back their contributions by 25%. This today is having serious consequences on the mission's ability to fulfill their objectives, especially when it comes to the fulfilling the civil objectives in those missions, because the military operations receive the largest part of the budget. Does this mean the end of peacekeeping operations? The United Nations like to say that the instrument can be adapted, but the Security Council is nevertheless, despite the differences, able to find common ground in avoiding new ungoverned spaces and spaces where the major powers could see non-state terrorist actors take over. This means that there is an opportunity in the short term to see a more detailed implementation of the peacekeeping mission operations as launched recently by the Guterres, and to better target the missions, to render these operations more solid and more safe, and to also provide them with better equipment. Yet this opportunity will depend on the abilities of the member states of the Security Council to once again resume dialogue on the objective of these operations and their financing. So which conflicts will be put on the agenda? The UN, will they take care of counterterrorism operations? All of this will have repercussions on the troops and the kind of deployments there will be and military equipment required. But in the short term, there's an opportunity here to implement the high-level peacekeeping operations panel's recommendations to have a cross-UN operations, that is to use other tools other than the peacekeeping operations alongside them to prevent rather than having to wage war. And here we see the United Nations being quite innovative by increasingly calling on the resident coordinators as well as the advisors for peace and development, and regional offices to try and bypass some of the obstacles that exist on the ground. As well, these are partnerships. They're more strategic in nature, both with regional organizations that are better accepted today than the UN in some areas. And on the other hand, it's also a partnership with NGOs who, due to their very nature, are more likely to be able to speak to the actors that the state do not want to allow the UN to speak to. So, of course, it is a mixed record, but rather than being entirely black, because especially the UN expects to see strategic thinking and revisiting because they want to not to be set aside through these obstacles, but they want to be able to continue working these international regions. Thank you very much, Marie-Joëlle. That was an excellent presentation. We will now turn it over to Stéphanie Martel for the contribution of the ASEAN to multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. You've got 12 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much for the team at the Network for Strategic Analysis for your invitation. My mandate today, at least the way I have seen it, is to convince you that ASEAN, despite its limits, continues to play a central role in security and regional order in the Asia-Pacific region, and that ASEAN is now better equipped than we believe in order to fulfill this role, but that its ability to execute this role will depend on its skill in bringing together different conceptions of security in the region and multilateralism as a whole. So 2 points that we often misunderstand when it comes to ASEAN and which are bring us back to the basic nations. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a regional organization, and to a certain extent, it can be seen as a regional organization as much as it, in fact, has a very small secretariat based in Jakarta with very few staff and an almost skeleton budget. And you can see the comparison figures here with the European Union here. When you place this information and when you match this against the exaggerated expectations we have of ASEAN, we understand why we're disappointed. And to come back to a metaphor which is often used in the region to contrast the European Union with ASEAN, the ASEAN is not a horse, rather it is a cow. And it's unrealistic to expect that a cow do the same thing as a horse. However, that doesn't mean that it has no value. The problem with ASEAN, however, is due in part to the fact that it has imposed objectives on itself that are unrealistic, and it does not do this because it isn't rational, but this is by design. As well, the organization is based on a regionalist model, which seems less familiar to us, in part due because it has fewer resources, but not only. Because ASEAN does not have a supranational vocation, it is consensus-based in decision-making, and again, it grants a great deal of importance to the non-interference principle. It is not a horse, but as well, it is not a unicorn either. It isn't all that odd. And in fact, if consensus were really at the heart of the problem of multilateralism, there was not much in terms of concrete action that we would see from NATO either. But its main duty is to lessen the mistrust between its members who have very little in common. Again, as we can see evidence through a long history of pre-colonial tensions in the region. Since the end of the Cold War, ASEAN has moved forward this function and its model in the region beyond the Asia-Pacific region, in part to meet with a request by its external partners as well, including the large powers who were unable to play that role. And this despite the fact that they have a much larger resources. So the outcome, once again, ASEAN plays a central position as part of large institutions. We have the East Asia Summit and the Regional Asia Forum, as well as the meeting of the Ministers of Defense of ASEAN Plus, This plus is a +8, which is made up of its main strategic partners, China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, but as well Russia and the United States. So who does not belong to these? Canada, which has been blocked for the time being. We're only a dialogue partner for the time being, but also the European Union, which has just obtained the very much sought after status of a dialogue partner, but for the time being, it does not have official membership at the Ministers of Defense table. In all, ASEAN for the time being maintains the legitimacy of being able to establish the rules for multilateralism in the Pacific area, and that continues to be a challenge, but it is achieving this despite all of the limitations. And despite very few resources, the ability of ASEAN to continue to play this role depends on its ability to reconcile different conceptions of security. First of all, we have a holistic notion of security, which is typical in the region, which includes the traditional and non-traditional views as well as human concepts. We also have a different idea of what a regional community is, that is Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific, and Indo-Pacific more regionally as well. And that is something that I would like to dwell on a bit more. We have a different notion of what multilateralism as a whole means. So what is the purpose of multilateralism? In Asia Pacific, there are two answers to this. The first, and the one that most of us, no doubt, are the most familiar with, and which is more obvious, is to address common problems through common solutions in concrete terms. According to this vision, the value of multilateralism is based on the observable and measurable results and quantifiable results that can be achieved with a direct causality. This is an approach we see the most often in the Western partners of ASEAN. It is also the main reason why there is such a disenchantment with multilateralism generally, and more specifically regarding ASEAN. However, multilateralism can provide a second answer, and I think that's more abstract. It is less tangible, and at the end of the day, this is also a means by which states and others conciliate differences or conflicts. This sometimes does give rise to conflicts, as we've seen in the region in South China Sea, but
that multilateralism is defined as conciliation among differences. It's more abstract and general, and generally is not as directly measured because it's not tangible, and there's no way to test in a lab what international order would look like with the institutions we're already partnering with and with potential partners. So this approach of multilateralism requires that we build faith in the process. Now, from a budget standpoint, that's hard to justify, but it's one of the facets of multilateralism that's central. And ASEAN has focused on concrete measures, mainly with respect to what we call low-hanging fruit, less sensitive issues, some being important to the region, such as managing natural disasters or pandemics. But these are issues where there's very little contradictory interest. And that's where ASEAN will shine. But the main value of ASEAN has to deal with its conciliatory approach to differences. And it's because this value is less tangible, then ASEAN is often seen as a weak or dysfunctional organization. But it is very important to the regional order. And none of the powerful states that are present in the area could fulfill its role. That's why every time partners in ASEAN suggest a new institution for the region, for instance, the Indo-Pacific region, or what they call an Asian NATO. And in fact, every time there's such a suggestion, we realize that once again, if ASEAN did not exist, there would be no local order. So the role of ASEAN in mediation is crucial. And it's also found in security issue management. Even if at times it's difficult to measure concrete results, ASEAN does play this role in the South China Sea, even though its members have contradictory interests at times. And it's not happenstance if many experts in China, and of course I think this is up for debate, but many experts in China who have tested this idea that China is revisionist believe on the whole that China is not that revisionist, even though it is even if it's counterintuitive in the South China Sea. And if we can say this, it's mainly thanks to ASEAN. The negotiation of a code of conduct has often been at a standstill for reasons that have nothing to do with ASEAN, but rather with the position of its member states, including and mainly China. For the past few years, we have seen some progress in these talks to the point where today it's possible for us to hope that we will one day have a code of conduct, which was not possible in 2012 or before. Now, the strategic area is a significant one, but the diplomatic ground is also important for other areas. There is no potential solution without diplomacy, and that's where ASEAN's role can shine. Now, could ASEAN do more? Probably. With the resources and constraints within which it operates, perhaps. Is ASEAN a miracle solution, a panacea for very difficult problems, intractable problems? No. Does a solution proposed by other multilateral organizations, would they provide better solutions? I do not believe so. I think by betting on ASEAN, we're betting on the right horse. Now, what I would say about Canada, which is really important for today's talk, and I'll close on this, when it comes to reflecting on the definition of our relationship with ASEAN as an institution, Canada has not yet defined its role. And it's still looking for its identity within the East Asia region. There are two aspects to our role. Canada has to acknowledge that multilateralism has an impact on both ends of the relationship. And it also has to support ASEAN's efforts in the area. And I would close by saying that the fundamental problem of Canada in Asia is that we're asking ourselves the wrong question. Why should Canada partake in multilateralism in the region, whereas ASEAN is wondering the opposite? Why should we give any sort of space to Canada in a multilateral table, especially if Canada can't define its added value? Thank you. Thank you very much, Stéphanie, for this presentation that we found very informative. And now we're going to move on to Costanza Musu for her presentation on the European Union and multilateralism. Costanza? Hello. I'm very happy to be here today. I want to thank my colleagues, Stéphanie and Justin, for their invitation today. I'll be making my presentation in English, but of course, I'll be answering your questions in French if you have any, or in English.
So today I'm going to essentially talk about the role of multilateralism for the European Union what it means for the European Union, and what, we'll give some comments on this idea or title of our panel, which is the multilateralism in free fall, and what that means both for the European Union and for Canada-EU relations. So my talk is gonna be structured as follows. So first, I will talk about the notion of multilateralism, what it actually means, how we can interpret it. I will then examine how multilateralism constitutes the backbone of EU integration and EU policy, what this means, what are the current challenges, and what has been the impact of the Trump presidency, and maybe the hopes for a Biden presidency for future changes. And I will conclude, obviously, with a quick look on the role of relations of the EU, between the EU and Canada. So I will start, as said, I will start talking a little bit about the idea of multilateralism, which has already been introduced when we first talked about this panel. And I think we need to stop for a second and think about what we mean exactly for multilateralism. And if we look at some early definitions, and by early I mean immediately after World War II, we see that the first definitions were really more quantitative than qualitative, meaning that it was about how many people were at the table. So in the sense, immediately post World War II, definitions of multilateralism, we have a definition of international governance of the many. And so really we have the idea of multilateralism as being in opposition to bilateral agreements that are seen as discriminatory because they would enhance the leverage of powerful over the weak and increase international conflict as a consequence. The thinking became a little bit more complex a little later, but still really around the quantitative notion. So for example, in 1990, Robert Cohen defined multilateralism as the practice of coordinating national policy in groups of 3 or more states. But here, as I said, again, we see more an emphasis on the quantitative aspects, and the definition really more in the 2000s came, especially with the work of Raggi and Caporazzo, that added the more qualitative dimension to multilateralism. So, for example, we have the definition of multilateralism as the coordination of relations among the 3 or more states in accordance with certain principles. And it's really this idea of principles that brings us to the change on how we understand multilateralism. In this sense, Raggi and Caporazzo argue that there are certain qualitative beyond the performatory idea of having 3 or more states at the table. We have other principles, organizing principle of multilateralism that have to be present for us to claim that the real multilateralism. And in a minute, I'll explain why this is relevant. And I think as we go through those principles, we'll see why this is relevant in today's world for the EU and also for Canada and relations between the two. So 3 properties have been discussed by Raggi and Caporazzo as being indivisibility, generalized principle of conduct, and diffuse reciprocity. And the idea is that indivisibility will be the scope that is geographical but also functional, so over which cost and benefit are spread. Generalized principle of conduct essentially are the norms that somehow regulate the relations between the states. And particularly important, the fact that these relations should not be based on individual preferences or case by case, but should be generalized. And then the diffuse reciprocity, which is really important, and it's this idea that we have a long view, states have a long view, should have, when engaging through multilateralism, should have adjust their lenses, essentially the utilitarian lenses, for the long view. And there should be a basic understanding that every state will benefit in the long run over many issues rather than every time on every single issue. So in this sense, multilateralism, as we're discussing it today, can be not necessarily just an institution, it can also just be an organizing principle, a way of defining relations between the states. The main problem and the main obstacle, and we see that in the EU, of which I will talk in a second, is that to truly organize the relationship around the principle of multilateralism, what is required of the participant is for them to renounce the advantages and the temptation to define their interest narrowly in terms of national interest, and foregoing essentially ad hoc coalition, define again in terms of national interest, in the interest of long-term gains that are actually diffused among all the participants. I think at this point it becomes clear how multilateralism is both something that is very much present in the European Union, but is really encountering formidable obstacles both within the European Union and outside of the European Union. Just the notion itself that states should not organize their policies around the narrow national interests already, given the events of the last few years, gives us an indication of how difficult that is. Now let's move quickly to the EU itself. For many, European integration and multilateralism has almost been seen as synonymous. Essentially, the EU, which was born, was created around the idea of the four freedoms, so to speak, the removal of the obstacle to freedom of movement for things, for people, for services, and for money, are really the cornerstone of the European Union. And the idea behind the creation of the European Union, of course, was that by somehow turning the EU, or rather European states, or the European continent, if you will, into a security community, meaning a community in which war as a currency of international relations was eradicated, would finally bring peace, and also would bring a shift from what we can see as a zero-sum game, where the power and dominance of one state constituted the loss of another state, to a positive-sum game, where the fact that you have members of the European Union that are strong and wealthy will not detract from other states, but rather amplify their ability to project their interest on the international scene. Now, this is the organizing principle, but over the years and the decades since the EU was first created as European Economic Community, all the way to today, we've seen a number of major crises. Some of them have been endogenous, meaning they were born inside the European Union. We can see crisis around the signing of the constitutional treaty, the Greek debt crisis, obviously Brexit, which we're still witnessing every single day, including this week, and then of course exogenous crises, from crises created outside that have highlighted the internal weaknesses of the European Union, to which the EU has been a struggle to react in a unified manner and really project a unified view. Those can be from the very inception of European integration, crisis coming from the Middle East, from the 6 Days War, to more recent Middle East crisis from the Iraq War, or the migration crisis, which was triggered by a crisis in the Middle East, in Syria. And these have all highlighted, in a way, the weaknesses of the European Union. Now, what I would want to argue here, however, is that to understand the European Union, we have to understand that every crisis that we see and that to us looks unprecedented and about to destroy the European Union is also, or at least has been until now, a crisis in which the EU redefines itself. We have to understand the EU in the context of not just an economic project, but a political project. And this multilateralism, at least at the internal level of the EU, has been to a degree, has become to a degree, really the daily currency of policy. Member states of the EU and the diplomacies of the EU have been honed through decades of thinking through this lens of negotiating their interests at the EU level rather than at the national level. Now here, however, I would say that one obstacle that we see is that really in that sense, while the EU might have created an internal multilateral system, it has failed to transport this multilateral system outside of itself. And this is where we see this notion of, fortress Europe, where really this, some have defined it a Kantian paradise. It's really a Kantian paradise that is all inside the European home. On the other hand, and here I would move to consideration about Canada and the EU in order to wrap up. These ideals are not ideals that have died altogether. They are still very much present in the European Union, and they do find correspondence also in Canada. And I would just close with some consideration on EU-Canada relations. I would say that while for Canada, the United States remain the main actor and the main partner economically, politically, the geographical reality is not going to be changed by the political vagaries of Washington. On the other hand, we should not forget that the EU is the second trading partner and is a very large trading bloc. And politically, for Canada, the EU offers affinities that time and again, and not only during the Trump years, Canada has turned to. And what we have witnessed, I would say, in the past 4 years is an awareness through the Trump administration, but really to an understanding that Canada, that the United States are not necessarily as reliable as we like to think they are in terms of their main policy lines, that there is a need for diversification in a way. The various agreements between Canada and the EU, including the CETA agreement, which is a trade agreement, and the Security Partnership Agreement, which is more an additional document, really emphasize the need for Canada and the EU to work together in order to promote the type of ideal dealings or ideal dynamic of international relations that they see as primary. And to that, I would add that another partner that Canada has looked at together with the EU and who is interested in this particular dynamic is Japan, creating essentially a possible triangulation of interest that could be very interesting and relevant to follow in the years to come. And I'll conclude with that.